Cool. Thank you. So yes, hi, I'm JJ. I'm going to start sharing my screen here in just a second. And I just want to kind of give a heads up in my presentation style. Normally I try to interact with the audience. I try to get you to talk to me about stuff, mainly because I've gone to a lot of conferences. I've been to a lot of presentations, and the worst thing I feel is when I'm falling asleep in the presentation because it's just so effing boring. So I'm looking for interaction. I'm looking for people to speak up and say stuff. And a lot of this is a lot of the journey I've been on over the last decade or so. And I'm hoping to have my lessons, tell you my story so you can see the advantages or disadvantages of the things I've done. Make sense? Can you get a thumbs up or something? Perfect. Yeah, there we go. Okay, also, I'm about to share my screen, and if anything embarrassing pops up while I'm sharing my screen, I apologize ahead of time. Oh no, I can't. Can I have access to share screen, please?
Yeah, 1 second. I always screw this up.
It's like you're about to just get off the starting line, and you just go wham right at the beginning. Like, oh,
you should be good to go.
Thank you. Perfect. Okay, so let me present this one, and I need my notes here. Pull this over here, and then go back to, oops, this one. This one, better. Okay, I'd never know why it doesn't do the title bar, so bear with me. But yes, hi, my name is JJ Asghar again. That's my Twitter if you want to follow me. And I actually do have the email address of awesome@ibm.com. If you know anything about IBM, that's pretty hard to get. And I'm really, really proud of it. So I've been in the industry since I've been about 15 years old. I started doing desktop support at Advanced Micro Devices here in Austin, Texas. Yeah, I should have mentioned that earlier. I am actually in Austin, Texas. I worked at Chef for about 5 years in the open source world. And a lot of these lessons learned came from that experience. I work at IBM right now. I've just hit my 2-year mark there, which in IBM years is a baby. But I believe I'm doing some really good work there too. I lived and breathed in the DevOps community since 2011. The only reason why I know that is because I have a T-shirt that says DevOps 2011 on it. That's the only way I know that I've been part of it. But I've done things up and down the stack from there, and I've always kind of gravitated towards open source. Okay. So I'm going to start this off by saying this isn't a tools talk. I'm not going to talk about specific tools as things to use. This is the squishy stuff. This is you have to learn about how to engage with an open source community. I believe, I'm sorry, I've already forgotten your name. Oh no, where'd it go? Hattie, you said you're just coming. Yeah, you're just coming into the open source world. So, oh, sorry. And so hopefully some of these lessons learned that I've learned about how to run these things, you can take some of these and engage with those open source communities with the ones that the tools that I've learned how to do or use. Same as with you, Jonathan, too. Hopefully working with some of the open source communities also, you can gain some knowledge from this. I might mention some tools here and there throughout it, but this isn't about me showing you how to use Chef or whatever. This is me showing you how to do the squishy stuff and how to deal with humans, because believe it or not, most of open source isn't programming. It really isn't. It's collaborating as humans coming together and getting a job done. In the world that we live in right now, with the COVID happening and the world just in general, believe it or not, I truly, truly believe this. Open source is a beacon of light of the way to see humanity at its best. Because if you think about it, open source work, unless you're very privileged, you don't get paid for it. It's all people do scratching an itch, right? So when you really put that in the paradigm of that, and notice that like humanity right now is very selfish and very just kind of very I'm on my own, but you still have scores of people coming together and getting projects done. And hopefully this will bring that conversation forward. Oops. Okay. So the third slide of this deck is specifically probably the most important thing you need to learn about interacting with an open source project, and it's scoping your project. I have seen many projects fail due to miscalculating what is expected out of the project to be successful. During the time I was interacting with the OpenStack community, for the longest time, OpenStack was a very specific group of projects that were very tailored to developers to build an open source cloud on it. As it started growing and more projects started feeding into the ecosystem, they had to figure out a way to bring projects into the OpenStack project to be able to get certification or whatever to say that they were part of the OpenStack community. They brought up something called the Big Tent. And the Big Tent was in essence a way for any project who created an account on a specific Garrett instance and created a wiki and had one release of code, now became an open source, or became a Big Tent project for OpenStack. This allowed a lot of major corporations to now say, hey, they have a bunch of OpenStack developers. But the problem is that you had people who all of a sudden started taking advantage of this. There were companies out there that actually gave you bonuses if you were able to get an OpenStack project started. So you saw people started gamifying and abusing these things. And that really ended up eroding away the community in OpenStack. Now, if you take one step farther into now our generation now with the Kubernetes ecosystem, you look at landscape.cncf.io, and you see how massive that ecosystem is. Every single one of those projects is part of the CNCF on some level. So they are already acknowledged as part of it, but they actually had to go through a process to get to it. They took the lessons learned from how OpenStack basically allowed everybody in, let everybody into the community, but they put up some gates to make sure that it was quality software of actual projects or whatever. So scoping your project correctly to make sure it gets what it needs to be done is very vital. On the flip side, sometimes you can scope your project too small. And Greg mentioned this earlier, which was I was part of the CRUX Linux distribution when I first started in the open source world. That whole Linux distribution, which is the proto version of a few Linux distributions out there right now that are mainstream, the whole goal of that project was to get the BSD style ports trees with the Linux kernel on top of it. That was it. Like it was just vanilla Linux upstream with the way you installed stuff on it was using BSD style ports tree. And that was such a small scope and such a small specific thing that it ended up failing. Well, not failing, it's still around, but the user group became so small and so whittled down because it was just one thing. And the scope was the complete opposite of OpenStack, which was you needed to bring more in. You need to get something to be excited about. Granted, years later, as I've revisited that community, I will say it is the same people that I saw back 10, 15 years ago. The funny part is one of the gentlemen, his name is, he goes by Jaeger on Freenode. Years later, I ran into, he found me through my name because I was part of the community because I use JJ Asghar everywhere. And turns out he actually lives up in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which is just north of me. I don't know, not north of me, but up in Oklahoma from where Texas is. And he was really big into the VMware community at the time. We ended up meeting at VMworld 3 years in a row just to like catch up and have a good time. And it's one of those great things about open source communities where even though it is, small, you still get that to be able to have those connections with other humans. And we're still friends today, which is great. Which reminds me, I should probably text him soon. Anyway, let's keep going. So there are two core buckets when I start looking at open source projects. It's kind of like when you look at beer, you have lagers and you have ales. Just like in open source projects, you have an open source project, you have personally backed, which is what I'm going to talk about first. And this is the majority of projects out there, right? When you look at something on GitHub that isn't that is scratching a specific itch for a specific human, that's personally backed. You've come together with a couple friends to build a project, to do a whatever, that's a personally backed project. Specifically, humans in the Bazaar, in the Eric Schmidt conversation of Bazaar and for the Cathedral, coming together to make things happen. It's all about scratching usually a specific itch to do something. The one thing you need to realize though is that if it's personally back, you become the leader of the project. You are the owner of what's going on. You are the end all be all. It's a double-edged sword, though, because with moving a project forward, you take responsibility, but at the same time, you take all the blame. So you can't, when you go down one path, you might piss a bunch of people off. It happens. I've seen projects where, I say this a little bit later, but I'll go ahead and mention it now, that you have to kind of look at an open source project kind of like a meetup. It's actually a pretty good apropos example right here, where we were talking earlier before the call started, and when y'all were meeting in a physical location, you had a really healthy group of people coming and really interacting and moving forward. But because of COVID and moving virtual, you've had to slow but sure taper off of people showing up. Same thing happens with open source projects. Because something major happens, you will see, like you can see a really cool thing happen, and then people slowly but surely taper off and less gets involved. I know I've started a couple meetups myself, and the many times in my life have I been sitting in a cafe in Austin, Texas by myself saying that I wanted to meet up at 6:30 on a Tuesday or whatever. And I was sitting there by myself because no one came. Same thing happens with open source projects. You need to be able to be willing to keep the flame going consistently. But most importantly to recognize with the personally backed projects is that you are the end all be all. So you have to have the correct face on. You have to be able to make sure you answer the issues properly. You need to be inclusive and be able to move forward with that. On the flip side, if you're talking about the ales to loggers conversation, the other one, in my opinion, is corporate backed. That's when you look at all the different open source projects, they kind of fit in these two buckets. This is probably the majority of open source projects that that have companies behind them are corporate backed and owned by corporations. So you might have some people playing the roles of influencers or using their what's the word I'm looking for, influence to be able to be successful in a corporate backed company. But like, for instance, with me at Chef, we had a whole corporation dedicated to open source software. And it was, we had to answer to the board. We had to answer to our executives at the time. The crazy part is there's a beauty to this, where if you be part of a corporate backed project, you can work on what you want to work on and be effective there, but you don't take any of the responsibility because you can blame the corporation. I realize how callous that sounds, but it's true. Where if all of a sudden IBM decides to kill a project, or Google decides to kill a project, or Oracle decides to kill a project, that's not the people who are part of the project, it's the corporation. So it allows them to be more fluid, to be able to give their things back to the open source communities they're involved in. but at the same time, they can kill your project at any time. There's great projects like maybe Google Reader that we all loved and adored that kind of died. And there's also a company out there that starts with O and ends with Oracle that took a database that we all enjoyed and changed it into something else. So it's important to realize that corporations, even more so, can have advantages and huge disadvantages when it comes to open source projects. So while you're moving forward and you're starting to engage with the different projects you're being a part of or leading, if you have the privilege of leading one, the next thing you need to core understand is having empathy for your audience. Believe it or not, as a maintainer or leader of an open source project, you are a performer and seller. Like you are all the time, just as I was saying personally back a moment ago. You have to be always on for your project. You always have to be recruiting. You always have to be showing it off in some way or form, because you never know who you are talking to in the community that can be beneficial. Maybe your thing scratches their itch that they didn't realize could be great for it. Or at the same time, just to get the name out there, because now when the project grows and you get more people using it, it feeds itself. But at the same time, if you say something wrong, you are a little bit more angry than you should be on an issue or something, because we're all human, we make mistakes. You can come off in a negative light. I should mention that having the empathy for your audience and growing your audience doesn't happen overnight. And as I was saying at the meetup a moment ago, where you have to really, really keep pushing, keep selling, keep recruiting. Matt Ray, who was my boss at Chef Software for a while, he said, he was like, JJ, the one thing you always have to be doing for Chef is recruiting. I don't know, like you don't have to be recruiting for the company. You need to be recruiting people to understand the technology. Always be recruiting. And you know, that ABC joke from, what's his name?
Glengarry Glen Ross.
Yes, exactly. I'll always be closing. Always be recruiting is what he told me. And also, when you play with when you start learning the empathy paradigm, you need to realize that most of the people involved are going to be volunteers. You need to keep that in the forefront of your head. People are doing free work for you, right? Like you've got to realize this. And it's amazing how many people, how many leaders and how many maintainers of open source projects completely forget this, that people have come there to be part of the community. They have there's no contract, there's nothing, well, there's a code of conduct and things like that, but there's no contract where you can be like, you can punish somebody or anything like that. Like leaders forget this. And it's really important to make that really relevant, is that open source developers are volunteers. So you need to be sure to engage with them on their level. It can take months and years to build a good community around a project, and it can all disappear overnight if you're not careful. We all know of different situations where that's happened. I don't need to really reference them, but imagine how quickly and how high and flying that project was, and then somebody did something dumb and how quickly it fell. And then something else came up, but that's open source in a nutshell. Anyway, so as I was walking through this presentation and trying to think of a way to hit this home even farther, I wrote up an article on my blog a couple years ago after I was talking to a gentleman from a rather large corporation. I said, JJ, you run a lot of open source projects. We want to open source one of ours. Can you give me 30 minutes and talk to me through the process? I'm like, hey, homeboy, you need a hell of a lot more than 30 minutes to talk about this. There's a lot of process here. He's like, wait, it's not just like putting on GitHub and opening up a wiki. And I'm like, good God, sir, no, not at all. Like there's all this thing going on. And during this presentation or conversation, I was looking out my window and there's a park out of my window, and I could see it. And in Texas, you can have trash pickup situations where you like, or try to get people to come together for a trash pickup. But because Texas is so hot, you have to get a permit to do that. And you have to set up like water stations and trash bag pickups and then collection places. And there's a whole slew of things you've got to do. And as I was mindlessly saying these things to this gentleman, which I admit I should have been paying attention to him, but stucking on calls all day, your mind starts wandering. I will say though, I realized very quickly that open source is just like a trash pickup. Nobody cares about the logistics that you had to go through as a human to get your project to be supported by your corporation. Nobody cares about who you had to talk to get that there. There are volunteers there to pick up trash at that place. They're there to beautify that project, to make things a little bit more comfortable and or successful. If you want to see the whole article, I can send you the link after the fact. But it's really, truly something to really think about when it comes to leading and maintaining open source projects, because you have to think of these things. Oh, someone's chatting. Give me a second here.
Yeah, JJ, this is great. I love the leadership stuff you've shown for open source, and especially in the Austin community. I got to run to another meeting. Greg, I appreciate it a lot. JJ, I sent you a LinkedIn invite, and feel free to reach out. And then Hattie, Jonathan, you guys can look me up, since you guys are looking for projects and things like that, and tell me about what you do, and we can see if I can help find a match. I sit on the Society for Information Management here in Indianapolis, so would be happy to help out if I can.
If you have a link you can throw into the chat, that would be awesome.
Like a LinkedIn, sure.
Something.
Thanks, Mark. Appreciate it.
So since we're paused,
Thank you,
I want to take issue with one of your sentences. So it's still good to feed them or celebrate the best workers. It's always good to celebrate all workers.
I'll get that in a minute. I'll get that in a minute.
Cool.
Thank you for actually reading it. You're one of the few people who's ever actually pointed that out. That's
it's interesting. Well, it's interesting because I've spent like the last year doing volunteer work, a lot of volunteer work, and not necessarily for a charity. My activities ended on November 3rd. But like I had, a group of volunteers all across the state of Indiana, and it was really like everything you're saying resonates with me, because I had people, spread across like all the cities in the state. So I met a lot of friends as a result. It was great. Nice.
Well, yes, to play off of that, the next thing you've got to do is celebrate. So if you, as you move forward in your project, you absolutely need to celebrate anything and everything. Every worker, anyone who joins, anyone who gets promoted to a maintainer. Version 1 got released. Hell, version 001 got released. It does not matter. You need to celebrate. It's a great way to engage with your audience, to see what people are saying and what they're doing. It's a great way to also highlight that someone who's stepped above and beyond what was going on, to make sure that they are known, that they appreciate it. And to Greg's point, you celebrate everyone involved, because again, they're volunteers. You need to give them some type of praise to make sure that they acknowledge that their work is not going into the void. Everything should be absolutely vocalized. If there's some type of mailing list, there's some type of website, however your project comes together and works together, you need to be able to do that. Nothing is too small to celebrate, and you take all and every win you have. Excuse me. But on the flip side, defeats. You have to own every defeat you have. You don't obviously vocalize it as far as you do with your celebrations, but being a leader or a maintainer of an open source project, you have to absolutely own your defeats. If something goes wrong, you need to own up to that immediately. If something breaks an upstream or downstream project because you're doing some library with your project, you need to say, hey, this is our fault, we screwed up. If something breaks and you cause an outage because it turns out you did an RM/RF in one of your install scripts, right? You probably should own up and say that that was a problem. And you will take some heat from it. But the more transparent you are about it and not hiding these things and having a change log or like a list of, oh, these are our fuck ups, right? Like, believe it or not, communities want to see that, because then the transparency will make sure that it is a truly open community to people coming in. I will say though, even with, at this point, humans can be very, very draining to this, because if someone starts seeing a negative side of a company or a project or an open source project, I'm sorry, in this case, I'm thinking of what happened to Chef. If you start internalizing a lot of these things, especially a personally backed project, you can get a lot of flack from the community, and people can just be very, very mean, just in general, just because something didn't work the way they wanted to. And it's important to recognize that with this friction that comes with a community, it's a part of the, it's what happens, especially when you get to the larger size of the projects out there. Adam Jacob is famous. If you just go through, who was one of the founders of Chef, if you didn't know, if you go through his Twitter feed from about a year ago, you can just see the friction that he had to deal with, where people's lives literally ran on Chef for the longest time. Like, people's lives literally, like their application text and everything was great. And then one little bad thing happens, which obviously cascades because it's configuration management. But this amount of bile that came out of it was so taxing on him that he actually took a sabbatical and got rid of his computers and everything, and took his family down to, I think it was Tijuana or something like that, and just disconnected from the world because he couldn't handle the amount of things going on. But he owned up to the things that went wrong, and he expressed those. And it's important to recognize that, where it's very frictionful. Anyway, it's not exactly a great topic to talk about, but it's something to at least acknowledge and realize that as a leader of an open source project, you have to own your defeats. You have to recognize these things. And also, Hattie, if you're looking to go into some more projects, it's a great litmus test or a dipstick or whatever you want to call it to measure that project, is if they are willing to talk about where they've screwed up. Because people screw up, it happens. We're a human. And if they hide where things have gone wrong, or if they've had problems, it's probably not a very healthy project to be a part of, or at least it's probably not a community that you want to look for to be a part of. There's many of them out there, don't get me wrong. Okay, so I've talked about some very general things here, and I want to take the next step and talk about the traits that I saw consistently through all of the open source projects that I've been involved in, and how they've reacted and how I see them. It's obvious, right? But it's true. It's very true. Trust is the most important one. If you have to trust your community, you have to trust the people that you're involved with in your project. You have to trust the processes that you put in place. If you do not have that trust, you will just, the project won't succeed. It's just that simple. You as an open source maintainer or creator or leader, you have to, when you put your code out there into the world, you are trusting people to being able to look at it anyway. So there's already this level of blind trust when you put that project out there, but then you have to continue that trust as your project grows. You'll be amazed on how many people just throw code out there and don't trust anyone to make any changes. They want to have an open source project out there, and then they'll never take a PR. because it's no. I do not want anyone else to touch my baby. This is my code. I'm putting it out here because of the licensing reasons, and people might be able to use it, but I will never make a change unless I come up with that idea. Obviously, those projects are very small, but you can find them on GitHub. When you release your code, you trust that many hands will make light work. But at the same time, you have to constantly recruit to make sure people are taking your project the way you'd like to. So keep that in mind. The next one is accessibility. And this comes from a really an interesting narrative with me in the OpenStack community. When I first started in the OpenStack community as a Chef employee, because my job at the time was I was supposed to be the OpenStack-Chef guy. I was there as the representation from Chef in that community. That community already existed. There was a bunch of rackers there from Rackspace. There's a bunch of people from AT&T there. There was a handful of people from a German telco that was there, and IBM. So all those 4 different companies came together on a weekly basis to be able to communicate about how to write Chef cookbooks to build an OpenStack cloud. Well, as we started moving farther and farther as we progressed, AT&T dropped out, Rackspace dropped out. It became smaller and smaller. But oddly enough, and this isn't the reason why I'm at IBM, it's another path, but IBM stuck around for a really long time. And there's this one gentleman there. His name was Mark at the time, and I think I actually still talk to him. He was still really, really engaged. And I was like, cool, this is great. And he's like, JJ, I really need us to find a way to get our engineers in China to be able to reach out directly to us. And I was like, this is a really weird way for you to ask. Like, why can't we just get on Google Meet? Because at the time we were using Google Meet to do this, or Google Hangouts, I think it was called at the time. And he's like, yeah, well, the China firewall blocks Google, so you can't do it. And I was like, okay, so what can they do? He's like, well, they can get on IRC. And I'm like, huh. Well, we have an IRC channel. It's one of the required for the OpenStack project. Well, why don't we just move our meetings into that? And there's a really interesting flip that happened at that moment, where now I was able to have for lack of a better term, it was an army. It was like 100 developers in China that were working on this project that I didn't even know about. I just knew through Mark, but he had a whole team, an army of people working underneath him. That because we moved it into IRC and that accessibility, all of a sudden they were able to engage for our meetings, and they were able to take and write out what they wanted to say, put it into their translation software, and then actually have it translated to what we were talking about at the moment. And it no longer became synchronous communication. It became asynchronous during the day, apart from our designated meeting time, where it became synchronous. And it was wonderful. I met all these people I'd never met, but didn't even know that was working with. I saw their commits every once in a while. I had no idea who they were, right? But it was good code. I actually got to meet some of them. I actually got to meet Mars. His name was Mars at KubeCon Shanghai before COVID happened, and it was amazing. I mean, obviously he didn't speak well English at the time, but I was able to sit down and talk to him for a little while, and it was wonderful because we moved everything into a place where people can actually interact at the speed of, honestly, US-centric developers forgetting that the rest of the world exists, right? Because we expect everyone to hop on a Zoom call and just speak English all the time. There's a whole nother world out there, and accessibility is really important to engage on. Also, because we made all our meetings at the exact same time every single week, we were able to have consistency, which was really, really, really important. And I learned about some holidays because I'm a Texan, right? Like, I don't see much more out of Texas. But I learned about holidays all over the world because people couldn't make that meeting. And I was like, oh, I didn't even know that was a holiday over there. And I learned more about other cultures. It was wonderful. Now, there's one last thing I want to mention about accessibility, which is, well, JJ, why don't we all just use Slack? Is probably the thing people usually jump on. And I believe Slack is what's a good word for it? Slack is a shortcut. It's not it's not truly accessible. There are companies out there that do not let Slack through, but they still let IRC through. There are countries out there that don't allow Slack through too, right? And also Slack owns all the software, or all the hardware that runs on those their servers, which is something to keep that in mind. Like Freenode is completely volunteer ran and is completely accessible for free with no questions asked. Only challenge is people don't really want to learn how to use IRC, and that's usually a hump to get over to teach people how to use IRC. But it's something to keep that in mind. Like Slack is easy to get people involved in for day one situations, but if as you build your open source project, Slack isn't open source, and that's something to keep that in mind. All right. So back to kind of what I was saying earlier about the scoping of the project. In tandem, clear vision comes into play, where you have to have a plan to move on if needed. We're all humans. We all get bored, right? We all need to find something new to challenge ourselves. And if you have a clear vision that's laid out, then your project will continue a life after you. But if you don't have a clear project, your project can take a complete left turn and go somewhere you have no idea where it goes. As an engineer, as a developer, you constantly want to learn. Your project will get stale. It will get crusty, and keeping maintainership of a project is a taxing position. People do get jaded and want to move on too. You will lose people in your projects. As I said a moment ago with OpenStack-Chef, we had Rackspace, AT&T, and I just went brain dead. But the point being is I had all these companies that were really, really involved, and fast forward a handful of months, they'd all moved on, right? It happens. You need to be able to give the reins of the project to someone else to be successful. I was privileged enough to have my OpenStack-Chef community. I had built really strong bonds with the engineers there, and I was able to hand what was called PTL, Project Team Lead, over to 3 different gentlemen over the next 3 years to be able to keep the project going and successful. I know of multiple German telcos who use OpenStack-Chef still, just because they've standardized it. And the moments I hear that, I'm just like, I can't believe that's still happening. And this is a good, 3-4 years later. Like, it's bonkers when you start thinking about it. At the same time, when you start building if you build those relationships and you can find those people you trust, believe it or not, when you move on to your next thing, you'd be amazed on how many people come along with you, and you'll find them coming along with you because they trust that you work well and you understand how to make things happen. It's a really crazy human thing that happens, but it's great, and it's something to be cognizant of. So I'm going to ask one final question, and this is kind of where I end it, and I hope you don't mind that I'm ending it a little bit early. I think all my clocks say anyway. Well, I'm just gonna.
Nobody's judging.
Okay, cool. I got to go make myself some dinner anyway. But yes, my one final question. Honestly, is it even worth it becoming an open source maintainer or an open source leader or starting an open source project? Well, with who I'm talking to already, and if you haven't walked away already from this conversation, yes, it is worth it. But to me, it depends. Like the great answer is it depends. You have to really balance the the pros and cons. And there's a lot of cons, but there's a lot of pros too. And being part of the technology community, and back to the beacon of light that I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, it's important to recognize and really think about these things. And if you have the privilege to be able to do open source professionally, which I know I acknowledge this day in and day out, I want to make sure that my lessons that I've learned from the position of privilege I've been in, I give back to the communities I'm involved in. Because if you get to take that step, I want to be sure that as a friend I haven't met yet, you're more successful than me, because I want you to be more successful than me, because that is what open source is building upon each other to be able to make something beautiful and great. So hopefully that you've learned something and kind of moving forward. And I just want to say thank you. If you want to take a picture of that QR code, it sends you to a Google form that is just for me. It's 4 questions that I genuinely would love for your answers to be. You can put as short or as long as you want. It's directly for me to try to make myself better as a presenter. And I really hope you learned something and you enjoyed this.
So from a personal perspective, when you ask, let me start with a question. What value did you get being in charge of one or more open source projects from like on your own resume, right? So if you go and try to find a paying job, what's the benefit of saying, hey, I worked on OpenStack-Chef?
So what I learned very quickly is that it became more so the networking and the human interactions of building my professional network, more so than the code that I was doing. Granted, I'm a developer advocate, right? So I'm not really a developer. I'm not really an advocate. And I get to talk about stuff in academics. I don't actually have to do real work. That's supposed to be a joke. But what I gained out of it truly was connections, to be able to find and be able to reach out to people in the community and engage with them on some level. I was able to be a trusted person, that I was a known entity, and it's amazing what doors can open from that. It doesn't pay off immediately. It really doesn't. But it's one of those things that if you stick with it and you show that you follow through and you do the lion's share of the work that you need to get done, and you don't set the house on fire, you'd be amazed on how quickly that follows you the rest of your career.
So for somebody who's maybe in their 20s and they just graduated from school, to follow up on this question and narrow it, or and I guess make it even more specific, like a lot of companies, and I try not to do this, I get discouraged when I run across somebody who's brand new to the industry or has been around for a while and they don't have a GitHub, like, but I don't necessarily subscribe to like, I'm going to go through this guy's GitHub and see how great his code is. I think that's creepy. I don't know. It's just me, and it's one of the lamentable facts of like social coding, is that a lot of times people are judged before they're even like met in person. But if let's say you're in your 20s and you're fresh out of school, would you recommend picking up an open source project just for the fact that it seems that interviews these days are changing, where you are kind of expected to have something to demo right on the like first, second interview, and like, personal example, I mean, I've been around since the 1990s. I was astounded. I went for this job and it took me like 38 hours to interview for it, because I wasn't prepared for their kind of job search, where they wanted me to have, a portfolio and go through a presentation and all this stuff. And so I had to bust my rear end, ended up not getting the job, and actually ended up having a very impolite conversation with people who interviewed me, and I think they deserved it. But if you're starting off and you're, like trying to get into into the computer industry, I guess, would working on or starting an open source project like help with that?
So that's a very loaded question. I'm going to acknowledge that from the very beginning.
Yeah.
But from first blush, the ability to start and create an open source project that is not squishy, that sticks around. That is a very different skill set than doing coding for a company.
Right.
It is two very, very different skill sets. And there's the Venn diagram. There is an intersection there, but in general, they're very, very different. So I think if you, as a developer coming out of college who needs to quote unquote get the reps in, sure, write some projects, do some toy apps, or create something that you want that scratches your itch, and then put it out there. Sure, it's a great way for you to show that off. I know that every single what you mentioned, the 36 hours or 38 hours of work, whatever. I've only been through that twice in my career so far, and the first time around, I didn't even do it properly at all, where they actually laughed at me. And then the second time when I was told that I needed to do this, I was like, you're getting free work off of me? Fuck you. Right? Like that's pretty much what I said. Because that's not who I am. Right? Like that doesn't gain, like, what is it? I think it was because I just watched Silicon Valley at the time. And did you ever watch did everyone watch Silicon Valley? Really? That's very surprising.
Sorry.
No. It's just really, really close to home. Like in the tech industry, it's really close to home. So if you want to see some really funny jokes about our industry in general, it's really good. But part of it is one of the main characters goes through a tech interview too, and they bring him in to work in their office for the tech interview, and he quickly realized he was actually doing their Jira tickets at the time. So he was doing for his interview the actual work for the company, and he was like, "What the hell? This doesn't make any sense." Turns out that's a whole tactic over in Silicon Valley. But what I'm trying to get at is, if it scratches your own itch, absolutely do it. You need to bring something to show that you're worth hiring. Like, but at the same time, and no 20-year-old ever wants to hear this. You've just come out of university or school or whatever school you've gone to. You need to also realize you are interviewing them. You need to see if you can fit in their paradigm, because believe it or not, it's something that I wish I learned well earlier in my career, where I'm trying to find my tribe. I'm trying to find the people I need to work with, because being an engineer as a software developer, you are a very, very highly sought after and skilled individual in this world. The nerds have truly inherited the earth, and you need to realize you are in a position of power. Problem is a lot of companies don't want to acknowledge that, and you have to change that paradigm in that conversation. So did I answer your question, or did I dance around it?
I think you got it. So, and final thing that I have to say, and I'll shut up and everybody else can talk. But is it worth it? I haven't really run an open source project. I've committed, pull requests when I find bugs and things like that. But in other kind of communal efforts like that, absolutely is. For the simple fact that you're doing something else that A, you want to be, and B, you gain value from. And I think that's a huge thing. You can look back on that and say, okay, I did something that I felt contributed to society, and that in itself, like, that is the kind of work that motivates me more than anything else. So yes, I would agree. It is absolutely worth it.
Awesome.
Just out of curiosity, how would you rank like going to a meetup compared to contributing to open source? I mean, actually having the in-face, seeing the people.
Yeah. So I still believe meetups are the best way. And I'm actually an organizer for the Austin DevOps meetup, right? I still run it monthly myself, or not myself. I have a team of people, obviously. It's not just me. And I still believe that is the best way to get the network going in the area that you want to be a part of. The interesting part about it is that because we now live in this COVID virtual world, I'm calling in from Austin, Texas. Y'all are up in Indianapolis. By the way, I didn't realize you were Eastern Standard Time. I thought you were Central also. Shows how little I know about other than Texas. It was a joke. Hopefully somebody smiled. But the beauty of being part of this COVID virtual world is if Jonathan, if there's a place you wanted to move to, you could join their meetup and start networking in that community very quickly. You'll be able to engage and be able to find, like, I mean, Mark was saying it a moment ago, right? Like he said, reach out to me. Maybe I can help you find something.
Yeah.
That's what meetups are for.
Yep.
That's to show that you have the passion to show up, to be a part of that community.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm just, I don't want to take up too much time either in case Satya has some questions.
What is IRC? What is that? The communication method. What is that?
Yeah, it's called Internet Relay Chat. It is the bedrock of how chat rooms were created when the internet first started. There's a thing called Freenode. I'll put it in the chat so you can just see it.
Warning though, there are dragons all over IRC.
That is true. That is very, very true. Freenode though, Freenode is one of the better ones because it's a lot of open source nerds. And if you go there, you'd be amazed on, like, you can jump into chat rooms where you can find like Python programmers that are 24/7 just working on Python, and they're willing to help you, or Node programmers just right there. But to Greg's point, there are some very
nefarious characters.
Yeah, you gotta be willing to shrug some things off because people can be pretty fucking mean. But there are some really good gems in there if you're willing to walk through it.
So an interesting thing about Freenode, because I still get on IRC from time to time because, again, I'm old, is that, like, I'll join pound AWS. Most channels start with pound and then letters, and pound AWS is to keep, I guess, the unwashed masses out of their channel or something. I'm not sure how that works, but I'll join that. And typically if I have an AWS question that I can't find an answer to anywhere, like, I'll go in there and there's somebody who knows what's up. So,
yep,
yeah,
that's true.
For people that, like, if you're really stumped, give it a shot.
Yep. If you play it all in the Red Hat world or CentOS or Fedora world, everything still ran through IRC there too. So I had to rediscover it because of Red Hat being bought by IBM. So I was like, oh, hey, I remember all this.
I've never actually learned how to use IRC like competently. I can get on, I can register my username, and I can maybe type in like /me or something that's about it. I do not have IRC skills.
Yeah, no one does.
There should be really good GUIs for it now, right?
There are some very Quassel, believe it or not. If you do want to go down this rabbit hole real fast, give me a second.
I mean, I'm just thinking if it's fair enough describing it essentially like very old Slack these days.
Very old Slack, yes.
Yeah. So.
Well, believe it or not, Slack was actually originally built off of IRC. Yeah, if you actually go into the history of what Slack was, Slack originally was a gaming company that they created an NIRCD daemon for their server so they could have communication while they were playing their game. And they realized they started putting a bunch of like nice to haves around their chat while they were making this game. And then their venture capitalists found out about this little like portion of it, they're like, we can actually turn that into a product. Your game sucks, kill that. And that's why they call it Slack, because they were slacking off during that time period. Like I'm 95% sure that that story is true because of the people that I know in the community, but it's amazing when you see that kind of stuff. So here we go. It is right. Sorry, give me 2 seconds here. This right here. And just by seeing how it's all just text anyway, this is actually probably the easiest way to get into it. It's as you see, it's just a bunch of channels. As you can see, Ubuntu. That's all Ubuntu stuff, but you get the point. So like you can find nerds that'll go real deep, real fast with a lot of stuff. I think they even still do Linux development through their mailing lists, the Linux GitHub or Git patches and IRC. So anyway,
Good stuff. Okay, well, I will let you off the hook again. Last Tuesday of every month, with the possible exception of December. We're also always looking for speakers. So if you happen to have something that you'd like to talk about, that would be awesome. So you can hit us up on the Meetup page and just send us a chat, and we will gladly take any talk suggestion that you want. Check out indiehackers.slack.com since we're talking about Slack. So that's a local group here. There are always jobs open on there. So I want to talk about what Developer Town is hiring for right now. I think Developer Town is currently hiring mobile developers. We're not hiring for DevOps, sadly, so I can't grow my team. But if you have any Xamarin skills or if you've done Swift or anything like that, we are looking to talk to you. So, and thank you very much. It was a great talk. Hopefully I'll see you guys next time around.
thanks, y'all.
All right. Have a good night, everybody.